Marcus Henderson stared at the lawyer's email for what must have been the fifth time that morning, unable to fully process the information it contained. At 32, he had grown accustomed to his predictable life as a software engineer. His downtown studio apartment suited his minimal needs perfectly, close to the few cafes he frequented, with good internet connection for his remote work, and just enough space for his modest collection of books and his beloved golden retriever Pixel. The death of his uncle Robert 3 weeks ago had been unexpected. A heart attack at 63, the doctors had said. Marcus and his uncle hadn't been particularly close in recent years, their relationship reduced to birthday calls and occasional holiday visits. Still, the loss stung. Uncle Robert had been his father's only brother, and after his parents moved to Arizona for retirement, the only family Marcus had in the city. As the sole beneficiary named in Mr. Robert Henderson's will, the email read, "You have inherited all assets, including the residential property at 1420 Oakwood Lane." Marcus had assumed his uncle owned the house, perhaps with some savings. He never expected to inherit an entire apartment complex. The property was located in Meadowbrook Estates, an upscale suburban development known for its manicured lawns and strict community guidelines. The 8-unit building was one of several in the area, all governed by the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association. According to the documentation, the units were all currently occupied with tenants on varying lease terms, managed by Westfield Property Management. Marcus took a personal day off work and drove to Meadowbrook. He hadn't visited his uncle's home in years. The neighborhood was even more pristine than he remembered. Perfectly trimmed hedges lined the sidewalks, seasonal flowers bloomed in coordinated colors, and not a single mailbox stood at anything other than the regulation height and distance from the curb. He parked his modest Honda Civic in front of the building. His building, he corrected himself mentally. The thought felt foreign, uncomfortable. The complex was attractive but understated, a 3-story structure with a small courtyard in the center. A plaque near the entrance read Henderson Place in elegant script. Marcus had never realized his uncle had named the building after their family. Inside the management office, Marcus met with Sarah Jenkins, the property manager who had worked with his uncle for the past 7 years. "Your uncle was a wonderful man," Sarah said, her eyes still showing traces of grief. "The tenants loved him. He never raised rent more than necessary for maintenance and improvements, even when market rates soared. He knew everyone by name, remembered their children's birthdays." Marcus nodded, a lump forming in his throat. This was a side of Uncle Robert he hadn't fully known, the community-minded landlord who valued relationships over profit margins. "He never mentioned any of this to me," Marcus admitted. "I knew he had investments, but not that he managed this place so personally." Sarah smiled sadly. Robert was humble that way. "He did mention you, though. He was proud of your career in technology. Said you had the brains in the family." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah walked Marcus through the business side of his inheritance, occupancy rates, currently 100%, maintenance schedules, the property's financial statements, and the building's relationship with the HOA. The complex generated a steady monthly income, far more than Marcus made from his software engineering job. "What do most people do in this situation?" Marcus asked. "I don't know the first thing about being a landlord." "Many inherit owners sell," Sarah replied candidly. "Others hire additional management to maintain distance. Your uncle was rare, he enjoyed being involved." Marcus thought about his quiet life downtown, his remote job that demanded little face-to-face interaction. He wasn't sure he had his uncle's people skills or desire for community engagement, but something about selling the building felt wrong, like erasing his uncle's legacy. "I think I'll keep the current arrangement for now," Marcus decided. "With you managing the day-to-day operations, I'll need time to learn." As he drove back to his apartment that evening, Marcus felt the weight of his new responsibility. He had unexpectedly become a property owner, a landlord to 8 families, and a member of a community he barely knew. He decided to maintain a low profile for now, observing and learning before making any significant changes. Little did he know that decision would lead to one of the most unexpected confrontations of his life. 6 months had passed since Marcus inherited Henderson Place. Winter had given way to spring, and the Meadowbrook Estates community was alive with blooming cherry trees and residents enjoying the warmer weather. Marcus had settled into a comfortable routine, balancing his software engineering career with his new responsibilities as a property owner. He visited the complex monthly, meeting with Sarah to review finances and maintenance issues, but otherwise maintained his distance, allowing the experienced property manager to handle the day-to-day operations. On a rainy Tuesday morning in April, as Marcus sipped his coffee and reviewed code for a new project, his phone pinged with an email notification. The sender was Meadowbrook Estates HOA, with the subject line Important. New Community Fee Structure Implementation. Marcus opened it, expecting a routine announcement about seasonal landscaping costs or pool maintenance as summer approached. Instead, what he found made him nearly spill his coffee. "Dear valued Meadowbrook Estates resident," the email began formally. In our continued effort to create a more equitable and supportive community environment, the Board of Directors has unanimously approved a new income-adjusted fee structure effective July 1st. Marcus read on with increasing disbelief. According to the policy, homeowners would now be required to submit documentation of their annual income, which would determine their monthly HOA fee. Those with above-average income would pay higher rates to subsidize community improvements and support residents with more limited financial resources. The email included an attached income verification form which required not only salary information but also investment income, rental proceeds, and other sources of revenue. The deadline for submission was 30 days away, with the warning that failure to comply would result in the maximum fee assessment by default. Marcus leaned back in his chair, stunned. Between his software engineering salary and the rental income from Henderson Place, he would certainly qualify for the highest bracket. But the invasiveness of the request troubled him more than the potential cost increase. The HOA was asking for sensitive financial information that went well beyond what seemed reasonable for a community organization. He picked up his phone and called Sarah. "Have you seen this email from the HOA?" he asked when she answered. "Just opened it," Sarah replied, her voice tight with concern. "In 15 years of property management, I've never seen anything like this. Income-based HOA fees? I don't even think it's legal." "That was my first thought too," Marcus agreed. "Do you know anything about the board that approved this?" Sarah sighed. "There was an election 3 months ago. Low turnout, as usual. The new president is Karen Williams from the East Side Townhomes. She campaigned on making the community more progressive and equitable, but was vague on specifics. Some of the other board members are new too." Marcus opened the email again, noting the signature at the bottom. Karen Williams, HOA president. Below her name was contact information and a quote, "Creating community through fairness and shared prosperity." "Has she ever met me?" Marcus asked. "Does she know I own Henderson Place?" "I doubt it," Sarah replied. "Your uncle kept a low profile with the HOA, just paid the dues and attended meetings only when absolutely necessary. And you're listed in their records as the owner of Unit 4B, which is technically correct since that's where we receive all the HOA correspondence. But I don't think they've connected that you own the entire building." Marcus thought about his options. He could comply, paying whatever increased fee they determined. He could sell the property and wash his hands of the whole situation. Or he could fight back against what seemed to be an overreaching and potentially discriminatory policy. "Don't submit anything yet," Marcus decided. "I want to do some research first, and maybe talk to some of the other owners in the community, see what they think about this." "Good idea," Sarah agreed. "There's a homeowners directory in the files your uncle left. Many of them have been here for years. They might have insights on how the HOA has operated in the past." As he ended the call, Marcus felt a sense of responsibility growing within him, not just to protect his financial interests, but also to ensure fair treatment for all the residents in the community, including his tenants. His uncle had cared about this place and its people. Now it was Marcus's turn to carry on that legacy, even if it meant stepping out of his comfort zone and into a confrontation he never anticipated. The day after receiving the HOA's email, Marcus began his investigation in earnest. He set up a dedicated workspace in his apartment with his laptop, a legal pad, and Pixel curled up at his feet. As a software engineer, Marcus was methodical by nature. He approached problems systematically, gathering data before reaching conclusions. This situation would be no different. His first step was to review the HOA's governing documents, which Sarah had emailed him that morning. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, and bylaws were dense legal documents, but Marcus combed through them meticulously, making notes on sections pertaining to fees and assessments. Nowhere did he find provisions allowing for income-based fee structures. In fact, Section 7.3 specifically stated that all regular assessments must be fixed at a uniform rate for all units of the same type. Next, Marcus researched state housing laws. 3 hours and several legal websites later, he had compiled a list of potential violations: discriminatory housing practices, invasion of privacy, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of the HOA's own governing documents. The policy wasn't just unusual, it appeared to be illegal on multiple fronts. "This doesn't make sense," Marcus muttered to Pixel, who looked up briefly before returning to his nap. How could they unanimously approve something so obviously problematic? To answer this question, Marcus needed perspective from other community members. Using the homeowners directory Sarah had provided, he began making calls. The first few homeowners were reluctant to speak openly, expressing vague support for making the community more equitable without addressing the legal concerns. But as Marcus continued reaching out, he found others who shared his apprehension. "I've lived here for 12 years, said Eleanor Bishop, a retired school teacher from the townhome section. "This new board is different. Most of us didn't even vote in the election, only about 20% turnout. Karen and her friends got on the board with just a handful of votes. Frank Rizzo, who owned a unit in the building adjacent to Henderson Place, was more blunt. Karen has an agenda. Before she was president, she proposed all sorts of changes. Community gardens on everyone's lawn, whether they wanted them or not, mandatory composting, a community fund to pay for her pet projects. We shot those down, so she ran for president to push them through from the top. The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't simply an ill-advised policy, but part of a broader vision being implemented by a board elected with minimal community input. Marcus decided to attend a local coffee shop that Sarah mentioned was popular with residents. He took a seat near the window, laptop open, but his attention focused on the conversations around him. A group of 3 women at a nearby table caught his attention when one mentioned that ridiculous income form. "I'm not sharing my tax returns with Karen Williams," said a woman in her 40s dressed in a business suit. "My income is none of her business." "Well, Robert never would have let this happen," another woman replied with a sigh. "He always kept the HOA in check when they tried to overstep." Marcus's ears perked up at the mention of his uncle. He casually moved tables to be closer. "Speaking of Robert, what happened to his building?" asked the third woman. "I heard his nephew inherited it, but nobody's seen him around." "Sarah still manages it, but the nephew is some tech guy who lives downtown. Probably just collecting checks and doesn't care about what happens here." Marcus winced at the assessment, but couldn't deny there was some truth to it. He had been intentionally distant, viewing the property primarily as an investment rather than a community he was part of. His uncle had been different, engaged, respected, a voice of reason in community affairs. As he left the coffee shop, Marcus made a decision. He would attend the upcoming HOA meeting scheduled for the following week, not as the absent landlord they assumed him to be, but as a concerned community member prepared to stand up against an unjust policy. The board didn't know who he was or that Unit 4B, his official address for HOA correspondence, belonged to the owner of the entire building. That anonymity might work to his advantage, at least initially. What had started as protecting his financial interests had evolved into something more meaningful, honoring his uncle's legacy by advocating for fairness in the community he had cared about. The Meadowbrook Estates Community Center was a single-story building with large windows overlooking a well-maintained garden. On the evening of the HOA meeting, Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a casual button-down shirt and slacks, professional but understated. He wanted to blend in to observe before revealing his hand. The meeting room was arranged with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where 5 board members sat shuffling papers and speaking in hushed tones. Marcus recognized Karen Williams immediately from the photo on the HOA website, a woman in her 50s with shoulder-length blonde hair and an expression of permanent determination. She wore a blazer with the HOA logo embroidered on the breast pocket, a detail Marcus found oddly pretentious for a volunteer position. He took a seat in the back row as other residents filtered in. Some greeted each other warmly, while others kept to themselves. By 7 p.m., about 30 people had gathered, a small fraction of the community's residents, confirming what he'd heard about low participation rates. Karen called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of a gavel. "Welcome to our May Homeowners Association meeting," she announced, her voice carrying a practiced authority. "We have several items on tonight's agenda, but before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone about our new income-adjusted fee structure. Forms were emailed last week and must be returned by the end of the month." A middle-aged man in the second row raised his hand. "I have concerns about providing all this financial information. It seems invasive." Karen's smile tightened. "The board has unanimously determined this is the most equitable way forward for our community. Those with greater means should contribute accordingly." "But is it legal?" asked an elderly woman near the front. "My son is an attorney, and he says—" "We've consulted with the association's legal counsel," Karen interrupted, though Marcus noted she didn't actually claim the lawyer had approved the policy. Now moving on to landscaping updates. Marcus observed the interaction with growing concern. Karen was skilled at deflecting questions and moving the agenda forward before opposition could coalesce. The other board members remained silent, deferring to her entirely. After 40 minutes of routine business, approving minutes, discussing spring planting, and announcing upcoming community events, Karen finally opened the floor for new business. "Are there any other matters members wish to address?" Marcus raised his hand, his heart beating faster than he had anticipated. Karen nodded in his direction. "Yes, the gentleman in the back." Marcus stood, aware of the eyes turning toward him. "I'd like to revisit the income-adjusted fee structure. I've reviewed the CC&Rs and state housing laws, and I believe there are several legal issues with this policy." Karen's smile disappeared. "And you are?" "Marcus Henderson. I have on Unit 4B. He kept his full ownership status to himself for now. Mr. Henderson, Karen's tone was dismissive. As I've already explained, the board has thoroughly vetted this policy. Then you should be able to explain how it complies with Section 7.3 of the CC&Rs, which requires uniform assessment grades. Marcus replied calmly, holding up a printed copy of the document. A murmur ran through the room. Karen's eyes narrowed. Our community is evolving, Mr. Henderson. Sometimes governing documents need progressive interpretation. That's not how legally binding contracts work, Marcus countered, maintaining his composure. And there's also the matter of privacy laws regarding financial information. Karen's patience visibly thinned. If you're so concerned about an extra couple $100 a month, perhaps Meadowbrook isn't the right community for you. It's not about the money, Marcus clarified. It's about fairness and proper governance. Easy for you to say, Karen snapped. With your big tech salary, what's a few hundred more? Some of us are trying to make this community accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy who can afford skyrocketing fees. The room grew uncomfortable as Karen's professional veneer cracked. Marcus took a deep breath and decided it was time. I understand community accessibility better than you might think, he said quietly. I'm not just the owner of Unit 4B. I own Henderson Place, the entire apartment complex, the building that provides nearly 40% of this HOA's total revenue through 8 separate membership fees. A stunned silence fell over the room. Karen's face drained of color as the implications set in. The other board members exchanged alarmed glances, clearly processing that they had just antagonized their largest contributor. You're Robert Henderson's nephew? Someone asked from the front row. Marcus nodded, suddenly feeling very much like his uncle's heir in more ways than just property ownership. The silence that followed Marcus's revelation seemed to stretch for an eternity. Karen Williams stood frozen behind the board table, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge for support. The other board members, 2 men and 2 women who had maintained dutiful silence throughout the meeting, now exchanged looks of unmistakable panic. Marcus remained standing, surprised by his own calmness. For someone who typically avoided confrontation, he felt strangely centered in this moment of tension. Henderson Place, Karen finally said, her voice hollow. You're Robert's nephew. Yes, Marcus replied simply. I inherited the property 6 months ago. A board member leaned over to whisper urgently in Karen's ear. Marcus could practically see the calculations happening behind her eyes. 8 units, each paying monthly HOA fees, representing a substantial portion of the association's operating budget. Perhaps we should take a brief recess, suggested one of the male board members, a gray-haired man who hadn't spoken until now. No, Karen said sharply, attempting to regain control of the situation. That won't be necessary. She squared her shoulders and addressed Marcus directly. Your uncle was a respected member of this community, Mr. Henderson, but that doesn't exempt you from our policies. As I said, this is about equity. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. I understand the appeal of equity, but not when it's implemented unfairly or illegally. He reached into his messenger bag and pulled out a folder. I compiled some research I'd like to share with the board and the community. Marcus walked to the front of the room and handed copies of his document to each board member before placing the remaining copies on a side table for other residents. This explains the legal issues with the proposed fee structure, including violations of the Fair Housing Act, state privacy laws, and our own HOA covenants, Marcus explained, addressing the room rather than just the board. I'd also included references to several court cases where similar policies were struck down. The residents began murmuring as they reviewed the documents. Karen glanced at them dismissively before pushing her copy aside. This is merely your interpretation, she said, though with less conviction than before. Our approach is innovative. It's discriminatory, interjected an older woman who had identified herself earlier as a retired attorney. Income-based housing restrictions were addressed by the Supreme Court in 1982. This young man is correct. More residents began to nod in agreement. The mood in the room had shifted palpably. What we need, Marcus continued, is a solution that addresses community needs without creating legal liability or invading privacy. He turned to face the entire room. I understand the goal is to fund improvements and keep the community accessible. I appreciate that intention, but there are better ways to achieve it. Marcus outlined his alternative, a voluntary community improvement fund with transparent oversight and published results. And to demonstrate good faith, he added, I'm prepared to match contributions up to $10,000 from my personal funds, not as the owner of Henderson Place, but as a community member who believes in Meadowbrook's future. The proposal was met with approving nods and a smattering of applause. The board members, except for Karen, looked visibly relieved at this potential exit from their precarious legal position. This is absurd, Karen broke in, her voice rising. You can't just waltz in here after months of absence and dictate a HOA policy. You're undermining months of work with your checkbook diplomacy. I'm offering a legal alternative to an illegal policy, Marcus corrected gently. And I'm not dictating anything. I'm suggesting we put both proposals to a community vote. Seconded, called out Frank Rizzo from the third row, followed by several echoes of agreement. Karen surveyed the room, her expression hardening as she realized she was losing control of the narrative and the meeting. The board secretary nervously suggested they should consider the legal implications before proceeding with the original plan. The treasurer began questioning the potential liability to board members personally if they knowingly violated housing laws. Fine, Karen snapped, gathering her papers. If you all want to be manipulated by the richest person in the room throwing his weight around, that's your choice. But some of us still believe in actual progress. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. This meeting is adjourned. 3 weeks after the contentious HOA meeting, Marcus sat on a bench in Meadowbrook's Central Park, watching children play on the aging playground equipment. The weather had turned warm, and the community was alive with weekend activity, dog walkers, joggers, and families enjoying the sunshine. Pixel sat loyally by his side, occasionally receiving pets from passing neighbors who now recognized them both. His phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from the HOA board, now led by interim president Michael Chen, the gray-haired man who had suggested a recess during the confrontation with Karen. The message was brief but significant. The board had unanimously voted to rescind the income-adjusted fee policy. Attached was a formal apology to the community and an announcement of a special election to fill Karen's position, scheduled for the following month. Karen had resigned 4 days after the meeting, citing personal reasons and a desire to pursue other community initiatives in her departure email. Marcus had heard through Sarah that she was already organizing some kind of tenant rights group in a neighboring development. He wished her well. Her intentions weren't wrong, just her methods. Marcus's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Eleanor Bishop, the retired school teacher who had become something of a friend in recent weeks. Have you seen the donation tracker? We're up to $8,700 already. Marcus smiled. The Voluntary Community Improvement Fund had been implemented within days of the meeting, complete with a transparent online tracking system that Marcus had helped develop. Residents could not only contribute but also vote on which projects should receive priority funding. The playground renovation was winning by a significant margin, followed by a community garden proposal and upgrades to the walking trails. With Marcus's matching contribution, they would soon have enough to begin work on all three. His decision to become more involved in the community hadn't been made lightly. For years, Marcus had kept to himself, finding comfort in the predictable routines of his work and solitary hobbies. But something had shifted these past weeks. He found himself enjoying the casual conversations with neighbors, the sense of collective purpose, a feeling of continuing something his uncle had valued. Yesterday, he had submitted his application for the open board position. The same neighbors who hadn't known who he was a month ago were now encouraging him to run, impressed by his level-headed approach to the fee structure conflict and his technical expertise. Mr. Henderson. Marcus looked up to see Adam, a 10-year-old who lived in one of his units with his mother, running toward him with a drawing in hand. I made this for the new playground, the boy explained breathlessly, holding out a crayon rendering of an elaborate play structure. Mom says you're helping build it. Marcus examined the drawing with exaggerated seriousness. I especially like the rocket ship slide, he said, pointing to a swirling blue line. The committee should definitely consider this design. Adam beamed before running back to his mother, who waved gratefully from across the park. These small interactions, Marcus realized, were what his uncle had understood all along. Property ownership wasn't just about buildings and income, but about the community and lives within them. Later that afternoon, Marcus met with Sarah at the Henderson Place office to review the quarterly financials. The building was running smoothly with high tenant satisfaction and stable occupancy. You know, Sarah remarked, you're a lot like your uncle in ways you probably don't realize. How so? Marcus asked, curious. Robert always said that success wasn't measured by how much you owned, but by how much you contributed. She smiled. You'll be proud of how you handled all this. As Marcus walked back to his car afterward, he paused to look at the building his uncle had named after their family. He had initially seen it as just an unexpected inheritance, a financial asset to manage from a distance. Now he understood it was much more, a connection to a community, a legacy of involvement, a responsibility to something larger than himself. The following weekend, Marcus began moving his belongings into Unit 4B. His downtown apartment lease was ending, and he had decided not to renew it. Meadowbrook was no longer just a place he owned, it was becoming home. As he unpacked boxes in his new living room with neighbors occasionally stopping by to welcome him, Marcus reflected on how differently things might have turned out had he simply paid the increased fees and remained in the background. Sometimes he realized the most unexpected confrontations led to the most meaningful changes, not just in a community, but in oneself.